Okay. So in case you haven't been to a Zoom webinar before, and a small chance I know, just to let you know, as my colleague Laura mentioned previously, you will be able to see and hear your panel, but as an attendee, you won't be able to share your own video or to speak. This is just down to the large number of people that we've got attending today, but we would love you to join in the discussion. So for that, could you please put your questions in the Q&A box, and if you just wish to make comments, that can go into the chat box. I'm delighted to say that Leanne Deman is going to be chairing the discussion for us today. So thank you, Leanne, for doing that for us. And I'm going to be handing over in a moment to my colleague, Laura, who is our Director of Product, and will be introducing our panel for you today. Also, my colleague, Eleanor, is going to be keeping an eye on the chat box. So if you have any questions that pop up in there where you want any help with anything, then she'll be looking out for that and hopefully posting 1 or 2 useful links for you as well. Okay. So without further ado, I will pass over to Laura, who will do some introductions for you today.
Thanks, Bryony. It's actually a bittersweet introduction today because it's the 4th and final teaching and learning webinar in this year's series. It's been really wonderful to see how engaged our audiences have been in this time. We've covered the themes of innovation, gamification and assessment with an incredible array of speakers, and I'm sure today's webinar on student engagement will be no different. No pressure. We're joined by the wonderful Leanne Deman as our chair today and Associate Dean of De Montfort University. Leanne is one of the co-authors of Achieving Teaching Excellence, Developing Your TEF Profile and Beyond, which served as the inspiration for this speaker series. It's rooted deeply in real-world experiences that can be put into practice, and we hope you'll get the same from today. And we're also joined by another one of our authors, Billy Wong, who is Associate Professor at the Institute of Education at Reading. Billy has just published The Ideal Student with us, so I'm excited to learn more today about characteristics of students that contribute to different levels of engagement. Our illustrious speakers continues with Russell Orr, Senior Lecturer at De Montfort, who will be sharing many insights around student engagement and ways to bring students together socially, even with the pandemic and distance learning. Lastly, we're joined by Lucy McGrath, Programme Leader at Liverpool Business School, who we are thrilled could join us after a reshuffle of our speaker lineup. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Leanne to talk us through today's theme in greater detail.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks, Laura. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I know it's a really busy time for academics at the moment as we're coming to the end of the academic year and assessment boards and everything that goes with that. So appreciate you joining us. We do have 3 fantastic academics joining us today for the panel. I will hand over to them shortly to discuss some of the initiatives that they have led during the pandemic. We'll then hopefully have plenty of time for questions and comments from everyone who has joined us. We were able to move pretty swiftly to online or blended teaching, and through training, trial and error, student feedback, we all fine-tuned our skills and we were able to deliver an equivalent teaching experience. How we achieve this and the lessons that we've learned, we've discussed this pretty extensively now over the last year. However, I think we can all agree one of the really difficult things was to replicate that extracurricular experience. Those conversations that happen normally when a student pops to see you after a lecture or a seminar, or maybe just groups together with some friends in the coffee shop to talk through their assessment that they've got coming up, knocking on the door of the office, dropping in for a quick chat, and not forgetting all of the social events that students enjoy while they're at university, the things that they do with the societies, field trips. Students have told us that they feel lonely and they're lacking the friendships that they would normally develop whilst they're doing these extracurricular things and all of the other wonderful things that happen on campus normally. And it's been pretty widely reported that students' mental health has suffered as a result. Now, we know that the link between student engagement and success with their studies is well researched, even prior to the pandemic. But as academics, we know that it's been harder to observe how students are engaging. So when the cameras are off, the microphones are off, how do we pick up on those social cues that indicate the students need more support? How can we check that learning is taking place? So it's easy to see in a seminar if a student's sort of drifting off, not really focusing on the subject. You can pick up, you can go and speak to them, you can ask them questions, find out ways to help them. And also their absence when they're not turning up to classes, it's far easier to pick up when things might not be going so well. And we've missed elements of that throughout the pandemic and our more blended approach to teaching and learning. So establishing a learning community is really vital for so many reasons, including students' well-being, but also that they've got the networks to support them to achieve their goals and have successful outcomes. How can we promote that sense of belonging so our students feel that they're part of something when they could be hundreds of miles away from us? And many of our students also come from, really diverse, disparate backgrounds and have already overcome a number of hurdles just getting to university in the first place. They could be battling so many different conflicting priorities at the same time as trying to study, much like us as academics. So, working, caring for family members, battling with inadequate technology, and then thinking about the devastating impact on students and staff where COVID has hit family members and caused illness and even death. So it's been a really, really complicated time. I'm hoping that through this webinar today, we'll be able to hear some tried and tested ideas, possible activities that attendees will be able to take back to your own institutions to try out. But of course, you're likely to have some really interesting ideas and things that you can share too. So please do add those in the chat so that we've all got something we can take away from today's webinar. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Lucy, Billy and Russell. I think we'll start with just discussing some of the initiatives that have been developed before we then open to some questions. So Lucy, is it okay if we just start with you and you can share what you've been doing at Liverpool John Moores?
Yeah, sure. Welcome everybody. Thank you for inviting me. Like everybody, I guess, we've tried a number of different things. The one I'm going to focus on today is probably one of the most successful new initiatives which we haven't done before pre-COVID and worked incredibly well in the virtual world, and also helped us to draw in students who we might particularly be wanting to target. So this was for level 6 students, and it was a series of online networking events. Now, we did this 2 ways. We did some through setting up events using our own alumni, and we also partnered with an organisation, Northern Power Women, who organised a very slick and professional networking event with employers in their network, which again was targeted at their final year students. We ran that event in day 1 of semester 2, so we got really good engagement, and we did a bit of work, but not a lot of work, about an hour session beforehand with the students on networking, what sort of things they should be asking. We gave them the profiles of the employers that were going to be there, and they rotated around those employers. I think one of the key takeaways from it, students' confidence. I think it was the confidence. There was from the survey that we did at the end, one of the biggest things that students felt that they got from it was an increase in confidence. We also contextualized it around, this is going to be the reality of when you start work, you need to be gaining confidence about communicating online in a professional environment. So having that little trial of doing that in a fairly safe environment with just a few of them in a virtual room with an employer was really helpful in gaining those skills, perhaps making a few mistakes on the way, but helping them towards preparing for virtual interviews and ultimately the workplace. We had so much positive feedback from students, and I really did feel, as I worked quite closely with my level 6 cohort, we had really reached some of those students that feel they don't have those networks, they don't have those family connections of their own, and we were able to put them in the virtual room with those employers. The employers that engaged with, obviously, with the type of people, they were very supportive because they'd chosen to be there. They were doing it voluntarily, so we had the right kind of vibe, if you want. I felt there was a really nice kind of quite relaxed atmosphere as I was dipping in and out of various rooms. So that was incredibly successful. We followed that up with some more networking events with alumni. Again, very successful in terms of encouraging students to think about the virtual world and working in the virtual world and helping them make connections, particularly those who, as I say, might not have those connections already in their family and friends networks. So much has come out of it. Confidence on LinkedIn, for example. We had 2 employees came back to us separately from the Northern Powerhouse event, and they wanted to do separate events with our students. We've also done some now with level 4 as well. And we are now looking to engage with alumni. In fact, just out of a meeting now around how we're going to carry this forward into next year. And I think it's lent itself very well to the virtual world, because it's so easy just to join a meeting as we are today from wherever we are. So I think particularly for the level 6s, it was a great way to start. You know, our hopes were up for coming back in the building in January. That didn't happen. And I felt like it was such a positive note on which to start the semester and secure that engagement and that thinking about what I'm going to do when I finish, because there was so much uncertainty at that time. And I think it really helped to keep the students, get them hooked in at the beginning. It just across the board in terms of their commitment in their modules, thinking about getting jobs. It was just incredibly successful, and yeah, we're quite proud of how that that went, because not everything that we tried did go so well, but that one I thought was particularly successful. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Lucy. I'm sure that I've got a few questions that I want to ask, and many of the people on the call do. So we'll come back to that hopefully in a moment and pick your brains a bit more. Can we come to you now, Billy, please?
Yeah, thank you. So the context of the example I want to give is for first year undergraduates, so level 4, and that's back in September last year when we were between lockdowns and social restrictions, and I was teaching new students who were starting their university degree. And remember, those are the students who also endured the exam fiasco. So there's a lot of uncertainties amongst our new first year students. So obviously, as first year students, they don't know each other. And the teaching that I was doing was split into pre-recorded lectures online, which I'm sure a lot of us were experiencing. And even though I added in a lot of these online forms that students can complete, when they're actually, watching the lecture, we still have to do seminars. And we did 2 types of seminars. One is for the in-person seminars for those who are on campus, and the other one is the online forms of seminars for those who cannot be on campus, especially our international students, but also for those who might need to self-isolate. So that was a setup. But what I also did, very conscious of how to promote this stronger sense of community, is I created something what I would call an online learning group. And it was my attempt to create this learning community for students to engage with the education beyond what is on the timetable. So we had a Microsoft Teams created for the modules, which have links to the lectures and stuff like that. But I also created a lot of sub-channels within the module teams, and I allocated different students into these different sub-channels. And I've allocated them into specific learning groups where they have an activity, a task, where they have to work together to plan and prepare for an online group presentation in relation to a particular topic or in relation to some of the reading activities. Now, the idea behind that is that I'm trying to bridge together the connections between students who are on campus and students who are not on campus, because they'll never see each other in the current setup. So having a very deliberate creation of these online learning groups where you have 2 or 3 students who are on campus and 2 or 3 students who are apparently not on campus, then we're trying to create this extra platform for students to be able to come together at their own time to arrange what time suits for them to build and create this 10-minute online presentation that they have to do. So that's the activity that I brainstormed at the beginning of September, just try and give that space for students to communicate with each other, because when you're new, especially, and all they've been told is that you've got this virtual learning environment. In our case, we use Blackboard, but it could have been Moodle. And then we've also got Teams that's been set up. And we're just trying to create all these spaces that allow students to be able to communicate with each other. So that's my quick overview of my introduction of an activity in response to the pandemic.
Thanks very much, Billy. Again, I'm sure we've all got some questions. So we'll move on to Russell, if that's okay, and then please, if you have got any comments or questions, drop them in the chat area. Russell, thank you.
Thanks, Leanne, and hello everybody. So yes, the real example that I'll focus on was an initiative that became known as Radio DMU. So I'm a senior lecturer in the law school at De Montfort, and the particular students that I would have been working with at the time were second year. And so this goes back to March of last year, so the initial weeks after the first national lockdown were announced. And luck played a big part in this, in a sense that on land law, my colleague Paul Omar, who worked on this with me, who isn't here today, we were in a very fortunate position that we had already actually finished the substantive material that we wanted to cover with the students. And so the face-to-face sessions that ended up being cancelled because of the lockdown were revision focused. And so our initial idea was simply to do a couple of virtual drop-in sessions that would focus on revision and prepping for assessment and so on. And I think I've said we imaginatively titled it virtual drop-in sessions. But the students themselves, as they came along, what we discovered was that the real conversations that we were having, perhaps not unsurprisingly, were focused on the events that were going on in the world around us and the uncertain position that we all found ourselves in. As much of that as there was really in terms of sort of substantive teaching discussion. And as part of this, we sort of naturally find ourselves wanting to talk more about general things, so Netflix recommendations or Amazon Prime recommendations or recipe exchange or different more social and interactive topics that would take people's minds off everything that was going on and the stress and concern that had been building up. And much to our delight, the students really bought into this. And two names were suggested by that original cohort of students. One was Land Law FM and the other was Radio DMU. And so we ended up sticking with Radio DMU because obviously Land Law FM sounds very thrilling and exciting, I'm sure, for all of you as well listening. But we focused on Radio DMU and actually, much to our surprise, ended up doing these broadcasts basically all through last summer with that group of students. And it ended up being a vehicle that helped them transition from second year into final year. And then we kept it going when they were in final year. We also then reintroduced it for the first year students that were transitioning into second year, all under all of these strange circumstances. And so it has been there in the background, not instead of, but as well as the use of the virtual learning environments for the delivery of teaching material. And the principal focus has been the sort of the community aspect, both in terms of facilitating students still having a more social and community focused interaction with each other, but also specifically then with us, getting to know some of the staff that are working with them in a different way. I mean, Leanne referenced it in part of the introduction. You know, so much of our day-to-day teaching experience, whenever things are face-to-face, can be dismissed as trivial. The 5 minutes you might spend chatting to students before you begin a lecture or a seminar, or the quick interactions you might have in the 10 minutes after a class is finished outside the room for follow-up, or if you're walking, you know, across campus or between rooms and a student might bump into you and ask you a quick question, or even in the queue for a cup of coffee. And as I say, these can be seen as incidental, but actually I would argue they're absolutely key foundations to part of the pedagogical architecture. It helps to build that sense of community, build that sense of rapport and interaction with students. And so fundamentally what we ultimately were trying to capture with this was to reintroduce that element of spontaneity and of allowing students a space where they could interact with us in a more informal way, as well as engaging with each other in that way. So as I say, it's still ongoing, it's still developing and growing, and it is still linked to land law, incidentally, for all of you that are massively interested in land law. But as I say, it's also then being used across the entire cohort in final year, second year, and we're going to be introducing it as part of the induction process for first year students. So that's enough waffle from me. If anyone has any specific questions, hopefully I'll be able to answer them. So thank you very much.
Thank you. There's some good questions coming in. Actually, there's one for all of you actually, and it's from a comment and a question that Laura Wagstaff has raised in the Q&A, and it's how do we engage those students with initiatives that aren't linked to their assessment? How can we make them appreciate how this extra curricular activity can help them have successful outcomes if their question is, which exam question will this answer, which is the sort of common query that we often get. How do we engage them? Anybody wants to come in with some suggestions here? I'm sure we'll all welcome them.
Well, Lucy, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I've got a real thing about timing with students. I think doing things in the first week of either semester. We only have 2 long semesters at John Moores. I think that's so important because I feel like you get such good engagement at that point, and it tails off. Anything that we've tried to do towards the end of the term, unless it's been linked to assessment, has been an unmitigated disaster, if I'm totally honest. I think thinking about timing is really crucial when you're trying to get students to engage with things which are outside, because like any of us, we start off really keen, don't we, as they do at the start, and then that gradually wanes and they get distracted. And once it does start to getting towards assessment time, I think that is, we keep trying, and I don't know why we do keep trying actually, because we tried to do something towards the end of this term and it was a complete fail because we just couldn't get them to engage with it because they weren't in that headspace. So I think timing is really crucial.
I would agree insofar as timing the beginning of something is crucial, and we found it very useful, as I say, to actually have this as a bridging initiative that followed the students as they moved through the summer from sort of second year into final year. So it began to build that sort of continuity for them. I mean, in terms of, it depends how you're gauging failure, really. I mean, there would have been times when we would have done a session where there were only 10 people that turned up. Then other times there would have been 70 people, other times 170 people. The feedback that we were getting from students was that we shouldn't take their occasional lack of attendance as a sign they weren't interested. What they found particularly useful was that this was something that they knew happened every week, regardless of whether they turned up, and that they could dip in and out based on their personal circumstances and so on. So that in a weird way, actually, over the course of the year, we had less of the usual manic interaction building towards assessment time as we used to have. So normally we would end up having lots of emails and lots of correspondence from students in the 2 or 3 weeks before an assessment is due. But because we had been doing this consistently from actually technically before the year even started, students had actually got a lot of that out of their system and had been engaging with us. And from our perspective, if you took a snapshot of any individual session and you happened to come along to the wrong session, you could look at it and think, oh, well, there's only 10 people here. You know, you're sitting for an hour and a half or 2 hours a week, and there's only 10 people. Why are you bothering to do that? But it's because even if it is only 10 people, if you do that twice a week and it's a different 10 people each time, and you then do that over 12 or 24 weeks, you end up reaching hundreds of students and end up getting that interaction from them. So yeah, I think timing is really, really important as well. And it's really great if you can capture that enthusiasm. But the only addendum I would say is that then to sort of persevere as the year goes on and not to be disheartened. I think occasionally we can sort of look through the wrong end of the telescope and sort of think that if we're not getting X number of students every time, that it's not worth doing. Whereas I sort of would disagree. I think it is worth doing, even if it's small numbers at times.
And if I can just chip in as well, I suppose going back to the original question about how do we engage students if the activity that we provide are not assessed. And linking back to my online activity, it is not assessed, just to answer that question also, but I do provide feedback. So it's a formative form of assessment. And the activity that I provided is linked to the actual summative assessment that they have to do is going to be a presentation. So it's designed in a way that it is a building step or a stepping stone or building block to support how students will actually do their own assessments online. But for the first time around, they get to work with other peers and they do it collectively. And I would hope that by looking at it from that perspective, students will see the value and get the feedback that I do provide to them on a group basis that they can work on in the final assessment, which would be the individual assessment.
Thank you. Thanks very much for that. Some good answers there. And I think we all know that, students will engage in various different ways depending on, how they choose to and what their prior experience is. Something that you'd said at the beginning, Lucy, in your opening, and somebody's raised it in the chat here actually as well. What didn't work? I know you've already mentioned timing, but what are the things that didn't work? And I open this to Russell and Billy as well. What are the things that we just won't bother trying because you've already tried them for us?
Well, I think that it's probably been talked to death, this one, but randomized breakout rooms did not work well for us. What else? Yeah, and yeah, that's interesting, thinking about whether we decide something is a failure or not. I think I get a bit, because we've got so many students, if we don't get a decent number there, like if I get 10, I just think, oh, that's not worked because only 10 came. So that's really given me food for thought there. I suppose a lot of the things that did work better were things that students could just go off and do in their own time. So things like quizzes, videos to watch, podcasts to listen to, those kind of things which we gave students to go away and look at. We probably did get quite good engagement with those when we look at the analytics. But some of the additional drop-in sessions that we put on for questions around courseworks and things, those were quite poorly attended. And I think students they get in that mindset, they can just fire off an email and they'll get a response instead of coming to the session. So those things didn't really work that well. Interestingly, in another faculty in John Moores, they have got this no email policy. They have developed a Q&A, a very comprehensive Q&A, and the students will always get directed to the Q&A. They will not respond to majority of emails to students, which I thought was quite an interesting approach. But quite a lot of the live online, we did find that quite hard to get engagement, but the pre-recorded stuff, they would go back, and someone's already mentioned that in the chat, that they're going to keep that. Students can keep going back and looking over things again and revisiting. So a lot of that probably did work better than us actually doing what we thought was the best approach and putting on a lot more live sessions just for dropping in Q&As, and those were not really well attended.
I think the point that you'd raised about breakout rooms has been picked up by a few people in the chat, and I just wondered whether there's anything more that you could elaborate on. Why do the randomized breakout rooms not work? What sort of feedback do you get from the students around that?
I think the students were very well. For one, they were getting used to being online initially, which was a whole new experience for everybody. They were very uncomfortable being online with other students that they didn't know. When we asked the students about it, they're very self-conscious about what they look like, about what their room looks like that they're in, about the background, all those sorts of things that I suppose when you're more confident, you don't really bother about. But there was a lot of those concerns that they just felt awkward and uncomfortable, and didn't like looking at themselves like we all do when we're in this virtual world, which is very odd because we don't normally do that either. We're normally looking at a room full of students, not at pictures, and not scrutinize our own appearance, which I am doing right now.
Yeah, just to add on what didn't work for me, we try to create social spaces for our doctoral students when the pandemic hit, again, using Teams to create that space to encourage people to participate, put in informations. But then despite good intentions and people really trying to engage for the first week or two, I don't think that Teams has seen any new messages for the last 6 months. And that's not unexpected in some sense, because people on the socials aspect, they like to have their own little groups. So they might use other type of applications to communicate with each other. So And obviously, when we create these groups, we're in there at the same time, which may have a, an implication to what kind of things they want to say. It becomes more academic focus rather than a social focus. So trying to stick ahead into the social element of how students interact with each other, it becomes very difficult. And even when I try to create those online forums where people can just type in questions as a space, and again, as very similar to Lucy, they'll just email me individually or as a one-to-one chat to ask for it straight away, rather than using these channels which I set up in the hope that will bring different forms of engagement. So there are things which is you have to try it, test it. If it doesn't work, move on, try something else, and hopefully find something which works the most for most people.
And I think just to chip in then, in terms of something that didn't work, this year, as I say, the final year students that are just finishing were the original second years that were part of Radio DMU. The second years that are now moving into final year, they were then the sort of main COVID-19 year that we're in second year while we used it. We did try to introduce it then with first years, but I think this goes to the points that Lucy had made and that I had picked up on before. Whenever we tried to introduce it with first year students last year, we didn't get them at the beginning. We didn't get them in that phase whenever everyone knew what it was about, really. And so I would say that our interactions with the first year students using the Radio DMU format for this sort of more social stuff, it was not as successful as it was with the other year groups. Now, it may be in the fullness of time that there is some other variable contributing to that, that it just doesn't work as well naturally with first year students. I don't know, but certainly I didn't think that it was as successful with that particular group. Beyond that, I mean, one of the things in the early stages that we were very concerned about was sort of digital poverty. And so the reason why we called it Radio DMU was that we, from the beginning, did not have cameras on for anyone. And we didn't insist on people using a microphone. They were, of course, free to use either if they wanted to, but it was all about allowing people to, so if students wanted to email questions in advance, we would then cover it in the broadcast. Alternatively, whenever they were there, they could type in, very much as our attenders are doing today, the participants today, they can type in their questions. And as I say, Paul and I worked together, even pre-pandemic. We did co-teaching and co-lectures. So we're used to working, the two of us, and we have that sort of dynamic. So one of us could monitor the chat while one of us was taking the lead, and then we can interchange in the middle of a session. But I think there was a real difference in flavour for me between the radio sessions that we did that were specifically focused on the social, so that was not in a slot that had been timetabled for any module. It was purely a social opportunity for them to come and have a chat, versus those that we then did use at times with specific modules in mind. Obviously, there was a slightly different character to those things, but I wouldn't say that it wasn't that anything didn't work. The only thing that really, as I say, struggled with would have been the first year group last year.
I think one of the things you picked up there, Russell, actually, is around the digital poverty, and we've all become really aware of those issues that have been presented. I mean, and Bethan's made a point in the chat. Bethan's in Egypt, and has said about whether students in the UK have access to the internet, to Wi-Fi issues, and just wondered whether, and I mean, I know that we've had a number of students that live in rural locations or are having to share their Wi-Fi connection with, 4 siblings that are Minecrafting and streaming stuff all at the same time. It can be quite difficult. I mean, what are the things that we could potentially do to help those students that might be experiencing digital poverty or connectivity issues?
Well, I think one of the ones for me that was particularly well received, I know, by a lot of students, was whenever the university was in a position to offer laptops and different devices, so the actual equipment that students were able to use, because it depends on what platform you're using, but some of them do use up more bandwidth or more memory than on your computer. And so if you're using a slightly older machine, or as a lot of students are, you're using a smartphone, well, if that happens to be sort of 5 years old or 6 years old, at times, if you have a large group of people and they all want to have cameras on and they all want the microphones on, that can get very cluttered and the devices can struggle. So, there's a limit to what we can do, I would say, in terms of ensuring that certain areas geographically have the required level of coverage. That's not really within our gift to control, but I think certainly initiatives whereby we can help to ensure that students have up-to-date equipment is something that I think we should definitely be looking into, because I know how well it was received whenever we did it last year.
Yeah, and just to quickly add on to that, I mean, the other thing which we have done is to try to have our materials online long before the seminar. So I usually do mine at least 3-4 days in advance so that people can potentially watch the lecture at any moments between those times, and hopefully during off-peak hours, if there is such a thing in terms of the bandwidth and stuff like that. But I do agree with also there is very limited stuff we can do. All we can do, I mean, is to produce and provide whatever we can in advance and be available to questions that students may have.
Thank you. Okay, so another question that actually is really relevant right now is from Holger, and it's about how you keep chat, how you keep up to date with the chat, the questions and answers. Obviously here we've got, you know, a really great set of hosts that are helping to manage this in the webinar, but it is quite a challenge when you're trying to, you know, answer live questions, monitor the chat. Do you have any suggestions about how we might be able to do that going forward, especially if you're, you know, solo teaching and you're trying to manage all of those aspects to it at the same time?
Well, I would just quickly jump in there. As I say, I try to hide behind Paul. I avoid solo teaching wherever I can manage it. But no, on those occasions where you are doing it, obviously we do it sort of to build in redundancy as much as anything. That particularly during the pandemic, there was always the chance that one or other of us could get sick at some point. So by having us both there for each of the sessions and each of the seminars, it meant that there would still be continuity if something were to happen. And obviously it helps greatly if you can split the load like that. If you can't, the only method that I've used that I found particularly good was to simply outline at the beginning, you know, if it's an hour-long session, you build in a 5-minute slot every 20 minutes where you make it clear from the beginning, I will be looking at the chat box between this time and this time. And so feel free to type away. In the meantime, feel free to put in all of your questions, but I won't be able to answer them until those moments for reflection. And that was the best way that I found to deal with it.
Absolutely. And it might be that this is part of where we can bring students in as part of the delivery and design and ask students to help answer those questions as well. So I'm looking forwards now to what we might be experiencing the next academic year. Someone here's raised that question about hybrid teaching, and we know that this has happened in some places, and it's certainly happening within further education at the moment. How do you manage the situation where you have students in the room and on Zoom at the same time? Have you had any experience of doing that, and do you have any suggestions for how that might be managed? Or is that a no? We haven't figured that one out yet. Because that will add an added complexity, won't it? If we've just talked about managing online, managing the chat, if you add into the mix a student, you know, raising their hand or a query in the class that then sort of excludes those that might be joining online, that could make it really quite complicated, couldn't it?
I'm not convinced that it's an optimal solution, if I'm being brutally honest. I realize it probably will happen to some extent, and there will be ways around it, I'm sure. As I say, something similar where you can make it clear to the people that are watching online, look, I can't be fully interactive with both groups at exactly the same time, and to simply set aside specific slots during whatever time frame you've got to tend to the needs of each group. But as I say, for me, I am a great advocate anyway of co-teaching, certainly in law, where so much of what we're hoping to get students to understand is that there are two sides to every argument at least. And so to have more than one person, as I say, it's what we've always done ever since I've started working with Paul, that I think we are going to try and maintain that approach as much as we practically can. And in the sessions where we can't, as I say, it'll be simply a case of laying out to those in attendance that we can't be fully interactive with everyone all at once. And
I think the comments in the chat here are suggesting that that it is quite exhausting. So we can see that there's people here that have got some experience. So any hints or tips that you've got, please do drop them in the chat, because I think this is likely to be something that many of us are gonna encounter in the next year or so. Billy, did you want to come in there? Sorry.
No, I was just going to quickly say that it very much depends on the equipment and the resources available in the teaching, because I think, you know, to run online and in person simultaneously, and I haven't done that yet myself, but I have colleagues who have done it, and I know it takes usually more than one instructor to do it. So they actually do it in a co-teaching. So one person will be dealing with the actual in-person, and then the other person, it's almost like a rotational thing. Other person will be observing what's online, but also preparing for the next batch. But of course, that doubles the workload that people will have and the availability of time to do that. So, I mean, the way I'm thinking about it, you know, if we ever move towards this online offline model, it's probably easier, despite taking longer, to almost do it in separate sessions. As in, you do the online separately from the in-person, rather than trying to blend it into one session. But that's just my personal thoughts in terms of what is manageable. Because the thinking of trying to squeeze those together is daunting for me. So I'm happily not teaching next term. So moving on.
Thank you. Yeah, so Peter's raised a question around this being the end of office hours, and we've all seen how students have interacted with us in a different way. So previously we would have, you know, a couple of hours, maybe 3 hours a week, you know, sectioned off for office hours or advice and feedback, whatever you call them. Students could book an appointment or drop and see you in your office. That's obviously, you know, somewhat changed quite a lot. Maybe you are still able to offer online office hours, but students have found hopefully that we're more accessible, and it's created that more immediacy in communication. So is this the end of office hours as we used to have them? Do you have any recommendations about how we might be able to manage that in a realistic way? Because we're not available 24 hours a day, and we do have to support all of our students. So has anybody got any suggestions there about how we might manage students' expectations at the same time as being visible and available for them? Go on, Lucy.
I think we're sort of perhaps planning for a bit of both, really, because the feeling from my staff is, and I think it's sort of fits with what everybody has been saying here today, is that we miss those physical interactions with the students. So we certainly don't want all that to go online. We have a bookable See My Tutor system at John Moores, which actually works very well, where we can put our office hours in and students can book in, and that could either be a virtual meeting or a face-to-face meeting. So it's not something that we have specifically been tasked with thinking about in detail. I think really it's going to be up to the programme teams to manage that, but I would see that as being a bit of both, perhaps. But we will still manage it within office hours, and I think students need to understand, and so long as their expectation, I think, is managed, it's always about managing their expectation. The problem that I will have, I know it, will be consistency, because we'll agree to something and then there'll always be a couple of staff who, with the best of intentions, almost too good, because then they will respond at other times. They will respond to a student over the weekend when we've agreed that we're not going to do that, because, oh, they were really distressed, and then it becomes mixed. The students have a mixed message then, and they think everybody should do that because that person did, so why doesn't everybody do that? I think that's quite difficult to manage, I find sometimes, because people do sometimes go a bit rogue on what's being decided, which doesn't always help if we try to manage the student expectations, because it's always about managing expectations, isn't it?
Yeah, I absolutely second what Lucy is saying. Especially, we use Teams, and I think most UK universities use a similar version, and the availability of instant messaging, just type in a chat message, not just to colleagues, but also to students, and vice versa, students can type to you. It does erode that boundary between when is your time, even if you switch on Do Not Disturb, or even if you go away, it is a message that just pops up sitting there waiting for you to be responded. And I don't really have an answer to how to deal with that. I mean, it is another way of communication in addition to email. But I do think, the traditional way of looking at what is office hour, where the students come in and knock on your door or just walk into a space, it might not be applicable to everybody in that sense. I'm trying to think of some of my earlier work. Going to the office for some students can actually be intimidating. They might not, they might feel that actually knocking the door is quite a scary process. But having that online platform does enable some students to be able to ask questions or to raise concerns, which otherwise may not be previously thinkable. So there are some benefits to this whole virtual system, but I absolutely agree that the blurriness between personal time and professional time, when it's office hour, when it's not office hours, definitely gone a bit, unclear at this time and age.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with most of what Lucy and Billy have said there. Really, there's not much that I can really add at this point to this one.
I think it's about managing expectations, because at the same, you want to be able to support the students, but you also want them to know, I'm sure we've all been in the situation where I've received an email at 10 p.m. on a Friday and then a chasing email on Saturday morning saying, why haven't you replied yet? And it's like, but there's just one of me, I can't, I do have to take some time off too, but you also want to be able to support the students, but it's managing those expectations from the outset, I think. And there's a couple of questions that are linked here, one from someone that's anonymous and then from Pekka as well, and that's around those students that we do struggle with. So those that maybe sort of disengage right from the start, who we always struggle to engage with, but then also recognising that some of our students who are struggling are less likely to engage, and we tend to find that if we do have initiatives and extracurricular, that it can often be the same students that attend, when really it's not always the students that we need to see, because they're not the ones that are struggling as much. So if you've got any advice or guidance on how we might be able to engage those that have disengaged, and how we can really get access to those students that need the support.
Oh, sorry, Lucy, on you go.
Yeah, interestingly, we were just having this conversation last week, because we always think you get the extremes. If you're having personal tutor meetings, for example, I always think you get the extremes. You get the really good students that do everything, they come to everything that they're told to do, and they're doing fantastically well. So they don't need a lot of support. And then the other extreme is you get the ones who are just about to go over the edge of the cliff, who have reached rock bottom. And it's those middle ones that we have problem really engaging with. So again, we're actually going to have a proactive approach to that this time, and do something again in that first week of semester one. We manage a lot of students on our courses, as I know a lot of business programs are very large in terms of student numbers, but we are planning a much more proactive approach to that, and meeting on at least one occasion very early on with personal tutors, and it will be on timetables, because I think particularly level 4, maybe by about February they realise, actually I don't have to do everything that's on my timetable, but I think at the start they do. When they first start, they're still a bit in school mode, and they will come to things. And I think if you can make that connection with them at that point, and they can see that their personal tutor is a nice, friendly person that actually does want to help them and be more like a mentoring kind of a role. I've got issues with personal tutor. We're trying to think of another name for it. So if anyone's got any good ideas. Yeah, but that is it. It's getting that engagement. Really find that really, really challenging. So anybody's got any good ideas about that, I'd love to hear them.
Well, the only thing that I would add, I think in my experience of doing the more informal radio show sessions, as I say, it started off with Paul and myself, but then whenever we were dealing with second years, we would invite certain colleagues that taught final year modules to come along and just do like a guest slot and join in. And so the students could get to know the people that were going to be teaching them the following year. We would also do sessions for sort of professional legal qualifications. So we would get colleagues that teach on the postgraduate courses to come and join in, not in a formalized way, but very much still in that spirit of informality. And I think it may well be something that if you can tap into that to get personal tutors, or whatever name you go with, to engage in a more informal way at first, I think that breaks down some of the barriers, because I think, as Billy made the point, for some students it's very intimidating, even in a virtual setting, to introduce themselves, and they're you know, particularly whenever they first come to university and they're in first year, I think it can be quite a difficult thing for a lot of people to, no matter how much we signpost and tell them about how they can come and speak to us, and we would encourage them to come and speak to us, and all of the different initiatives that every university has in place to try and make sure you support them, for them, until they have a bit of comfort with the individuals, I think for a lot of them it's a very difficult sort of step to take. So anything that can help boost that sort of dynamic between, and just in the experience that I've had this year, because as I say, joking aside, land law can be, I know this is going to come as a shock to all of you, but it can be quite a dry subject at times. And so in the context specifically of land law, you know, every year there are students that we have that will struggle to engage with certain aspects of it. And contrary to our expectation, we actually found that they were engaging much better, and it was easier for them to at least flag the fact that they weren't totally happy with a particular topic area. And I'm fairly sure, and some of them have certainly intimated, that that was as much to do with the fact that they had felt they had got to know Paul and myself a little bit better as it was anything to do with the actual teaching that we had done. So I think that that is a big part of it.
Yeah, just at Reading, we call ourselves academic tutors. I think on the chat, there's a lot of comments around academic advisors and so on and so forth. But just quickly going back to the point about, you know, engagement, I think one of the challenges in terms of in the online environment is what do we consider to be engagement? Is it a mere fact of signing in? Does that equate to engagement, or that's just registration or participation? Because there are times that I realize when I've been teaching is that you have students who signed in, but then they never do anything, as in they don't type, they don't show, and you don't even know if they're actually there, or they just logged into the computer and just went off to do something else. So there's different layers of engagement. And of course, for those who don't even sign in, that's going to be the most challenging. And unfortunately, I don't have an answer for that. But even for those who do sign in, within that, there's different layers of engagement, which is very difficult in an online platform when you can't, when you're not always able to see and interact with students, because the question around cameras and microphone is a huge one amongst our team, especially, you know, we feel like we are just, I don't know, a YouTuber live streaming, but we just keep talking, but we have no idea who we're talking to if there are a little feedback or engagement from the audience. And obviously, you know, things do get better as time goes on, actually trying to set our expectations. But again, it's also to do with how big is your class. If it's a smaller class, more manageable, then perhaps students will feel more comfortable. But if you're in a massive online platform with, I don't know, 50, 60, or even 100 plus, then, you know, the camera and microphone system wouldn't work at all.
Absolutely. And I'm going to apologize now because I've got gardeners outside. So, you know, that the reason why I should probably have kept my microphone off. I just wanted to discuss a little bit about how this, you know, how our students are now prepared for what's going to happen next. So particularly for those final year students, Lucy, that you were talking about, and, you know, you bringing in alumni, bringing in external speakers. I mean, we're preparing them for a world that they never thought they'd be entering when they joined us at university, and that whole, you know, helping to build their confidence. And I guess really as a final point, whether any of our panelists today have got any suggestions about how we might be able to help our students take the skills that they've learned over the, you know, these sort of digital skills and this online communication, how they then take that now to support their development and their outcomes. Lucy?
I think one of the issues I have, I think, with students is they don't understand necessarily the skills that they've got, and therefore they don't articulate them when they go to interviews, for example. So I do think we need to spend a bit of time going through with those students going into final year, setting out exactly the new skills that they have now got, because they don't translate academia to the workplace, and they don't do those connections in the physical world. And I don't think they're going to do that now. So I'd like to, we are going to do an exercise with our students where we're going to very carefully go through what is your skill set that you've got now. It's probably a little bit different to what you thought it was going to be like, but a lot of those skills are going to be very valuable going forward into the workplace. They just need to know that they've got them.
Absolutely, thank you. So I think because we've only got a couple of minutes left, we need to probably close the discussion now. There's loads of stuff. I've not been able to keep up really well with the chat, but there's been some really fantastic comments and questions. And I just want to thank everyone on behalf of the panel as well today for joining us. And I'll hand back to Laura, if that's okay. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. Amazing discussion. I wasn't even having to chair, and it was hard work keeping up with the chat box and the Q&A questions. So thank you everyone for your engagement in talking about student engagement. There are so many great ideas, and it's great to see people with similar experiences having guidance for each other. It's that community element that we love in bringing people together for these teaching and learning webinars. I should also point out that McGraw Hill does have solutions in supporting instructors with student engagement, lots of different ed technology that we have at our disposal, as well as ways to reduce administration and some of the headaches which you might enjoy a little less. So if anyone would like to get in touch with us, then we can introduce you to the academic consultants who'll be working at your institutions. We can have a conversation from there. But otherwise, I do want to give a huge thank you to all our speakers today, and thank you, Leanne, for chairing. As I mentioned at the start, it's been a really fantastic webinar series. You can catch up for those who haven't seen the other three online on our YouTube, and we will be sharing this recording in a day or two's time, whenever it comes through, with everyone who's registered, so that you can watch and repeat every other day, whatever suits you.
I just want to say a huge thank you to Leanne and to all of our panel today, and for my colleagues Laura and Eleanor for their assistance in running the event. And thank you obviously to everyone who's taken their time to attend today. I hope you found it a useful discussion. There's a few ideas that have come up that you might have a chance to try yourself in your teaching from next semester. So do keep in touch with us. Do let me have any feedback on whether you found the session useful. If there's anything else that you would have liked us to talk about, we may have future sessions and we might want to incorporate those ideas. So thank you once again. I will share the recording the next couple of days. Sorry, Laura, was there anything else you wanted to?
I was just going to mention that we have a book launch for Billy later next Monday. Later this Friday?
Thursday, that's 7th.
On Thursday.
Wednesday.
Wednesday. I'm so sorry, Billy.
I've got the dates right.
It's the 7th. It's Monday today. Wednesday the 7th.
Wednesday the 7th on the ideal student and deconstructing those expectations in higher education. So please do look on our website to sign up for that webinar as well. It's going to be a very good one.
Let me just pop the details in the chat in case anyone's interested in it right this moment. There we go. So you'll be extremely welcome to join us if you're free. Thank you. Looking forward to that one. Okay, I think that probably wraps things up. So thank you again, everybody, and I shall end the meeting shortly. Thank you once again for your time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.